The brazen bull. The brazen bull was an execution device from ancient Greece, attributed to Phalaris, a tyrant of Akragas. It was a large, hollow statue made of bronze, shaped like a bull. The condemned person was locked inside, and a fire was lit underneath. As the metal heated up, the victim would slowly roast alive. The design was intentionally cruel. The bull had a system of tubes that transformed the victim's screams into sounds resembling the bellow of an angry bull, turning human suffering into a grotesque spectacle. This was meant both as entertainment for rulers and as a warning for others. Over time, the brazen bull became a symbol of tyrannical cruelty. While some historians debate how often it was truly used, ancient records consistently describe it as one of the most horrifying inventions of punishment in classical antiquity. Flaying. Flaying was the punishment of removing a person's skin while they were still alive. This practice was documented in several ancient civilizations, including the Assyrians and later in parts of Europe and Asia. Victims were tied down, and knives were used to peel away sections of skin, sometimes starting from the limbs, sometimes from the torso. In some cases, the removed skin was displayed publicly as a warning to others. The purpose was both execution and intimidation. Death usually came from shock, blood loss, or infection, but the process was deliberately prolonged to maximize suffering. In Aztec culture, flaying was sometimes tied to ritual practices, where the skin of victims was even worn during ceremonies. Rat torture. Rat torture was one of the more gruesome punishments recorded in history. The method was simple but terrifying. A container filled with live rats was strapped to a victim's body, usually on the stomach or chest. Heat was then applied to the container, forcing the rats to look for a way out. Since the only escape was through the victim's flesh, the animals would begin biting and clawing their way inside. This form of torture was not a common legal punishment, but was mainly used in interrogations and intimidation. Historical mentions of it appear in both European and South American sources, particularly during times of political unrest when authorities wanted to extract information or create fear. The effects were severe. Victims suffered deep wounds, blood loss, and often life-threatening infections. In many cases, death wasn't immediate. The slow, painful process was exactly what made it effective for instilling fear. Crucifixion. Crucifixion is one of the most infamous punishments in human history, remembered mainly because of the Roman Empire. The process was simple in idea, but devastating in execution. A condemned person would first be beaten or flogged, leaving them weak before the main ordeal even began. Then they were forced to carry a heavy wooden crossbeam, often through public streets, to the place of execution. Once there, the victim's wrists and feet were nailed or sometimes tied to the cross. The body was left suspended in a position that made breathing extremely difficult. Death didn't come quickly. It could take hours, sometimes days. The combination of pain, blood loss, dehydration, and slow suffocation made crucifixion one of the most drawn-out punishments ever designed. It was also a public warning. Crucifixions were usually staged in open spaces, where crowds could see the agony as a lesson of what happened to rebels, criminals, or anyone who challenged authority. The most famous case is, of course, Jesus of Nazareth, whose crucifixion in the 1st century AD became a central event in Christianity. But the Romans used it on thousands, especially against slaves and political enemies. Impalement was one of the most feared methods of execution in history, used in parts of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The process involved driving a long wooden or metal pole through the victim's body, usually starting from the rectum or abdomen, and then carefully raising the pole upright so the body slid downward under its own weight. What made this punishment particularly terrifying was the precision with which it was carried out. Skilled executioners could avoid major organs, keeping the victim alive for hours, sometimes even days, as they slowly succumbed to internal injuries, dehydration, and shock. One of the most infamous figures associated with impalement was Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. In the 15th century, he reportedly used this method against thousands of his enemies, lining roads with forests of impaled bodies to strike fear into invading armies. Sawing in half. This punishment was as terrifying as it sounds. The victim was suspended upside down by their ankles, leaving the body's blood flow concentrated in the head, which kept them alive longer. Then, executioners would begin cutting the body in half with a large saw, starting from the groin downward. Because of the position, the victim often stayed conscious for much of the process, feeling every movement of the saw. This method was reported in parts of medieval Europe, the Middle East, and even in some Asian regions. It wasn't just about killing. It was designed to make a spectacle. Crowds would gather, and the slow, methodical nature of sawing ensured that fear spread through anyone who watched. Stories suggest it was used for crimes considered especially heinous, like treason or heresy. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is one of the most infamous torture devices in history, though some historians debate if it was actually used as often as legends suggest. It looked like a human-sized coffin made of iron, with two large doors that could close around a person. But the terrifying part was on the inside. Long, sharp spikes lined the interior walls. When the victim was placed inside and the doors shut, the spikes would pierce their body. Interestingly, the spikes weren't usually placed to kill instantly. They were arranged so they punctured non-vital areas like the arms, legs, and shoulders, causing immense pain and blood loss while keeping the victim alive for hours, even days. Some accounts describe the victim screaming from inside the closed coffin as the crowd listened outside. Whether every story about the Iron Maiden is true or exaggerated, its reputation alone became a symbol of medieval cruelty. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, used across medieval Europe, was one of the most brutal ways to execute criminals. The condemned person would be tied down, usually stretched across a large wooden wheel. Their arms and legs were positioned carefully carefully, not for comfort, but so the executioner could shatter them one by one. Using an iron hammer or a heavy club, the executioner struck at the limbs, breaking bones deliberately without immediately killing the victim. The goal was to leave the person alive, but with their body mangled and twisted around the spokes of the wheel. Sometimes, the broken limbs were even woven between the gaps of the wheel to keep them in place. Once this part was done, the wheel with the victim still strapped to it was hoisted upright on a pole and displayed in public. There, exposed to the weather and birds, the person was left to die slowly, which could take hours or even days. Lingxi was one of the most infamous punishments in Imperial China, lasting for nearly 1,000 years before being abolished in 1905. Unlike executions, meant to be quick, lingxi was designed for the opposite: prolonged suffering and public humiliation. The condemned person was tied to a wooden frame, and the executioner would begin slicing off small pieces of flesh one at a time. It wasn't a single lethal blow, but a slow dismantling of the body. In earlier centuries, this process could go on for hours, with hundreds of cuts delivered before the prisoner finally died from blood loss or shock. In Chinese belief systems, dying with your body intact was important for the afterlife. Lingxi robbed people of that, making the punishment as much spiritual as physical. Scaphism. Scaphism was a form of execution, recorded in ancient Persia, designed to be as slow and humiliating as possible. The condemned person was placed between two hollowed-out wooden boats or tree trunks. Their head, arms, and legs were left sticking out, while the rest of their body was trapped inside. They were then force-fed large amounts of milk and honey, which quickly caused severe diarrhea. More honey was smeared over their exposed skin, making them a target for insects. The victim was left floating on a stagnant pond or marsh, fully exposed to the sun. What made this punishment so feared was its duration. The insects would swarm and bite, crawling into wounds, eyes, and even internal organs once the body started decaying. Keela hauling was a naval punishment, practiced mainly by the Dutch and occasionally by other European navies from the 16th to 18th century. It was designed to punish sailors for serious offenses like desertion, theft, or mutiny. The condemned sailor would be tied with ropes, then thrown overboard on one side of the ship. The ropes were passed under the keel and pulled, so the victim was dragged beneath the entire vessel and brought up on the other side. What made this punishment terrifying was the ship's hull itself. The underside was usually covered with sharp barnacles, rough wood, and metal bolts. As the sailor was dragged along, his body would be torn apart, causing severe injuries, bleeding, or drowning if he couldn't hold his breath.